Welcome back. We are currently on War Brothers, Chapter 20. This one is called Lizard. I would rather be eaten by crocodiles or hippos than be captured alive, muttered Paul. No one disagreed. There must be a way across the river. We could build a raft? Suggested Jacob, but they all knew that would take hours. They sat in silence. There were no tears, just overwhelming tiredness. They had come so far, only to fail. We can wait until dawn. Maybe we'll be spotted by government soldiers, suggested Paul, but even as he spoke, they all saw the flaw in the plan. From a distance, the government soldiers would think them rebels and open fire, and if the government soldiers could see them, likely the rebels would see them too. I know something, whispered Hannah. At least, I think I know something. All the boys leaned in to listen. Any idea would do. Anything. When I was serving the commanders, they were talking about collecting the guns they wanted to trade Jacob and his friends for. Hannah paused. I was not paying much attention, but they said that now the deal was off, they had no use for the boat. A collective intake of breath was audible as each boy tensed up. Hope. They had hope. What else? Think, Hannah, said Oteka. It was the first time he had said her name. Just something about a boat that was left for them, to be used to pick up the guns. I'm sorry, that is all I know. I did not think it important at the time. Hannah's voice caught. No, it is good. It is enough. Jacob touched her hand. It makes sense, said Oteka. If Coney had plans to trade you for guns, then he must have had a way across the river to get them. He spoke while training his gun on the crocodiles and hippopotami that lounged by the water's edge. Somewhere, there must be a boat, and it has to be on this side of the river. This is the most direct route from the camp. It must be near. The boat would be guarded, hissed Paul. Perhaps. We will have to split up and stay hidden. I will go west along the river. Norman and Paul, you go east. Count out 1,000 steps, and then turn back. I will go with you, said Jacob, as he smacked his legs and arms. The reeds by the river were thick with mosquitoes. No, stay here. The fewer people walking around, the less noise will be made, said Oteka. This was true, but Oteka had also noticed Jacob's bloody feet. The lion had been tracking the smell of Jacob's blood. Soon, Jacob would not be able to walk at all. Maybe they could carry him, maybe not. Hannah seemed to be struggling too. And there was something more. Someone had obviously betrayed them. Someone had seen them leave camp and had alerted Lizard. In Oteka's mind, that person had to be Tony. Jacob might be blinded by friendship, and maybe even Paul too. Oteka could not trust Tony. Best that Hannah and Jacob rest and watch over Tony. Come closer. Oteka motioned to Paul and Norman. They came together in a huddle. We will climb back up the bank and walk along the ridge. Look for a freshly made path down to the river. That is where the boat will be. And look for markings. Whoever left the boat would have left a sign, a signal of sorts. All agreed to Oteka's plan. Jacob handed Paul Tony's gun. They had 2 guns now, plus the pangas. Wordlessly, Paul grabbed the gun and, together with Oteka and Norman, climbed farther up the riverbank. At the top of the bank they split up, east and west. African elephants roamed the ridges of the river. Peaceful, lumbering, smart, they paid no mind to the searching boys. Below, curled up in the roots of trees, Hannah and Jacob waited. Tony? Jacob's voice was quiet. Tony sat on the ground, mute and glassy-eyed, with his knees pulled up to his ears. He is dead inside, said Hannah, but his body continues to walk. It happens. No, not dead. Sleeping, maybe. Jacob inched closer to Tony. Tony, listen to me. If we can cross the river, we can go home. It will be over. Jacob reached out to touch his arm, but Tony edged away. Fear had vacated him, and what was left was an empty shell. You are right to worry about him, said Hannah. The commanders. They can tell which boys can be broken like glass. Shattered glass cannot be put back together. When the good boys become LRA, they become especially mean, especially dangerous. I have seen it happen over and over. How do they know which boy to pick? Jacob asked. Bullies always know. Jacob sat down beside Hannah and ran his hand over his hair. The pebble in a leather pouch tied to his wrist bopped him on the nose. Magic stones that Coney had said would protect them from bullets. Yet more proof that Coney was mad. Jacob ripped the pouch off with his teeth and threw it into the river. I have worn this for so long I had forgotten, said Hannah. She, too, tossed her stones in the river. Together they watched them sink. Did you ever... Jacob stopped himself mid-sentence. He had no right to ask. Did I ever kill? Hannah spoke softly. No. I was considered too useless to be a soldier. I was a slave and a servant. But because I served food, I was able to steal and eat. I was never caught. Not once. She spoke with pride. Jacob might have grinned in another circumstance. Instead, he looked up into the night sky. The dying moon kept ducking behind clouds, making darkness clamp down on them as tightly as a lid on a pot. Then, in the next moment, it would be light enough to make out a face. In this country, in his Africa, it was possible to see heaven while standing in hell. Jacob looked at Hannah from the corner of his eye. Under the thin band of material wrapped around her head were gaping dark holes. She would carry the scars forever, and if they survived, forever people would stare at her, nudge each other, and say that she was once a girl soldier. It would not matter if she'd killed or not. She would never find peace. If we live, we will live, said Hannah. What will you do? I will join the nuns and become a teacher. It is what I planned. It is what I want. They stopped talking for a moment and let peace settle. Your feet, thorns? Hannah motioned towards Jacob's swollen, bloody feet. Jacob shrugged. Try as he might, he could not dislodge the painful thorns. I will try. It was still too dark to see the thorns, so Hannah carefully, gently felt her way along. One by one, she pulled out the slivers. Jacob ran his hand along his soles. The thorns had been removed. You would make a good nurse. I will make a better teacher. Yes, you will make a good teacher, agreed Jacob, and this time he felt his face crinkle into something like a smile. It was a strange sensation. I know the names of many children who were captured and killed. I repeat their names to myself before I sleep. One day, I will tell parents what happened to their children. One day, I will tell the whole world. If people know what happens to children like us, they will help. Hannah seemed so sure. Jacob had a thought. It was unlikely, but perhaps. There is a man who often comes to my father's house. His name is Musa Henry Torak. His grandson was abducted. I do not know when. His name is Michael. Have you heard of him? Hannah, too shocked to reply, turned and stared at Jacob. Do you know of him? Jacob repeated. Hannah nodded slowly. And so do you. Lizard. You know him by the name Lizard. Chapter 21, One Shot. We have found the boat! Paul was panting. It's not too far, and it's not too much, but it should float. No guards, but the path is newly made. Furiously smacking mosquitoes, Paul slumped down onto his haunches and took in a long breath. Norman, right behind him, did the same. And there are elephants up there, huge ones. Paul pointed up towards the ridge. A boat? How big? Asked Jacob. 6 of them had to get across the river. The words should float were not especially reassuring. Big enough. We must go. Now. Paul stood again. Jacob grasped a tree branch, pulled himself up, and looked down the shoreline. The crocodiles looked back. Dawn was not far away. Oteka has not returned, said Jacob. Go then, said Paul, still catching his breath. I will wait here for him. Oteka and I can run. You will be slower. Norman, you guide them. Norman nodded. Paul had not yet looked at Tony, or even acknowledged his presence. Tony sat in a stupor, unsure of where he was or what was expected of him. Jacob gently pulled Hannah to her feet. She cringed and took baby steps forward. Tony, come with us, said Jacob. Tony stood and followed. Norman, on the ridge, waited the dying mango tree. Paul pointed up to a ledge above them, then turned to Jacob. They used the tree to mark the path down to the river. It has been split with an axe. And Jacob, watch out for elephants. Elephants? Jacob wasn't the least bit concerned about elephants. Crocodiles? Yes. Hippos? Definitely. Snakes? Absolutely. Spiders, too. Mostly, he was afraid of rebel soldiers. Did the commanders know that Lizard had left camp to track them? Or had Lizard set out on his own? They had no way of knowing, but either way, soon the rebels would come after them. Norman, Jacob, and Hannah scaled the riverbank hand over hand, then walked along the ridge in single file. The sound of the river and the feel of the path guided them. Jacob stretched his hand out to feel in the dark. Hannah held on to the back of his shirt. The moon had almost died, and the sun had yet to be born. It is always darkest before the dawn, Jacob remembered hearing. It is the same with life, thought Jacob. He felt the slightest jab. An okuru ogwal bush. Hannah made it safely past, but Tony trailed behind. "Tony, be careful," Jacob called. Too late. Tony stumbled headlong into it. Poisonous barbs pricked his skin. Tony seemed to hardly notice. Pre-dawn bird chirps and monkey chatter were beginning. Faster. They had to go faster. "Look," whispered Hannah. The landscape ahead was open and barren. The silhouettes of lumbering, mountainous creatures appeared black against the faintly gray sky. They seemed majestic and calm. "Elephants are a sign of good luck," she said. "Big rats, if you ask me," said Paul. He and Oteka had come running up behind. One day, thought Jacob, if we come out of this alive, I will ask Paul why he hates elephants. They came to the dead mango tree. Slip-sliding back down the bank, they stopped abruptly at the river's edge. There it was. It did not look very promising. Each of them squinted and considered. Once it might have had a small outboard motor, perhaps, but there was no sign of one now. It lay half submerged on its side. "It might not be as bad as it looks," Hannah said softly, but there was doubt in her voice. Oteka and Paul laid their guns on the ground, and battling tall reeds back with their arms, waded into the river. The front half of the boat bobbed in the current, while the back half was mirrored in sand and rocks. Jacob and Norman soundlessly placed their pegas on the ground and walked gingerly into the river, searching out flat rocks on the muddy bottom with their toes. Hannah was about to follow them when Oteka called out in an almost inaudible hiss, "No, wait!" Jacob stood in the water at the bow. Oteka, Paul, and Norman took up positions, and the four of them rocked the boat until they could heave it out of the sand and right it. They inspected it for damage. "Look," said Paul. He was pointing to markings on the side of the boat. Most of the painted words had been scraped away, but the letters SA and L and GE were still legible. "Sambia Lodge," whispered Jacob. "This boat belongs to the lodge. It was left here deliberately for the rebels. They made it look damaged." There were no holes in the bottom, or, at least, none that they could detect in the pre-dawn light. "Norman, get in," said Jacob. Norman took hold of the gunwale and hauled himself out of the water. He fell, face first, into the boat. "Oya ma konya, ma maniwala," Paul hissed, and pointed to a dozen of leeches, long, slimy, black, and as thick as a finger, that were welded to Norman's back and legs. Paul lifted the leg out of the water and let out a low moan. Oteka stopped to listen. He had heard something. Animals? Rebels? "Hurry! Get back in the water! Shove off!" Norman leapt back out of the boat, his face twisted in revulsion. Hannah placed the pangas in the boat, then slipped on the slimy rocks underfoot and plunged into the water. Water flooded her mouth. Coughing, she found her footing. The harder they tried to be quiet, the more noise they seemed to make. Tony slung both guns across his back, stood on the rocks, and made ready to push the boat off. Again they rocked the boat, and then 1, 2, 3, heave! The boat slipped away from the shore. Oteka hoisted Norman back in. Tony, in a mad moment of awareness, made a giant leap from the rocky shore and sailed through the air to land with a thud in the bow of the boat. As the boat slipped into the stream, Jacob, Hannah, Paul, and Oteka fell face first into the filthy water. Splashing. More noise. The current from the waterfall was weak along the shoreline, but farther out, towards the middle of the river, the boat would be carried away. Oars. Where were the oars? Jacob was the first to break the silence and called out to Tony and Norman, "Come back!" Hannah, Jacob, Oteka, and Paul lunged towards the boat, gulping water. They beat the water with their arms. The splashing aroused hippos on the shore, which dove under water to prance effortlessly along the bottom. Crocodiles, too, responded to the movement in the water. Early morning was feeding time. Tony found something tucked under a thin strip of wood running along the length of the boat. It was a sturdy pole, which he tossed to Norman, who stood at the bow. Norman, small, weak, starving Norman, struck the pole into the water until he felt it strike the rocky bottom. He put all his force into anchoring the boat with the pole, but he would not be able to hold it steady for long. With broad strokes, Oteka reached the boat first and heaved himself over the side. Spluttering and nearly drowning, Paul lunged towards the boat too. Oteka found the oars and stretched one out across the water to him. "Take it!" he cried. But it was Hannah, not Paul, who reached it first, with Jacob pushing her from behind. She grabbed hold and Oteka pulled her in. Jacob kept his head above water until Hannah was safely in the boat. But then the last of his strength ebbed away. He lifted an arm, then slipped helplessly under the water, and he was gone. The water was murky. It was impossible to open his eyes. He held his breath but began to sink. Through the stillness, he could hear someone shouting his name. It was peaceful underwater. He had seen death so many times, looked at it, escaped it, challenged it. Perhaps now was the time to die. Perhaps it would not be so terrible. Everyone died. Air bubbles dribbled out of his mouth and floated to the surface. He was not afraid. He had done his best. He thought of his mother and father, of home, the farm. He even thought of Ethel and wished for her a husband. Something was moving towards him. He didn't care. He felt a powerful and mighty force come up from behind him. He did not fight. Up he went, dragged to the surface. Arms encircled him. He was being pulled along, and then hands came down. Oteka, who could not swim, was in the water with him. It took Norman, Tony, and Hannah to drag him into the boat. Water spouted out of his mouth as he heaved, flapped, and floundered on the bottom of the boat before flopping over onto his back. He opened his eyes and saw fear on Hannah's face. Oteka pulled himself back into the boat. Paul. Where was Paul? A shot. Gunfire. Rebels? Government soldiers? Instantly they all cowered down. Standing at the stern of the boat, with a gun trained on the water, Tony put a bullet between a crocodile's eyes. Paul, flailing about in the water, was less than an arm's length from the crocodile's mouth. Tony dropped the gun, reached out, and pulled Paul into the boat. Paul and Oteka tried to paddle. To row evenly together was impossible at first. Then it became merely difficult. After a few more minutes, possible. Norman held his position at the bow, and Tony stood at the stern, looking back with his gun cocked. No one questioned his right to hold a gun. Jacob, still struggling to fill his lungs with air, did his best to collect himself. The current was strong, and twice the boat veered to the wrong side of the river. The sun was not fully up, but the sky had lightened. Just as day turns suddenly to night in Africa, so too does night suddenly turn into day. "Look!" Tony called out. Faces popped out of the bush on the riverbank. Rebels. They were standing on the spot where the boat had launched. They had been minutes, mere minutes behind them. A dozen guns were now pointed at their boat. Down! They dove for the bottom of the boat. Its thin wooden shell would offer no protection from rebel guns. The current was moving the boat along quickly. It was no longer possible to paddle without risking their lives. "Why aren't they firing at us?" Paul's voice wobbled. "Maybe we are too close to the government soldiers," said Oteka. "Our Father, who art in heaven." Once it would have been Tony whispering a prayer, but now it was Paul. They all lay still and waited. Chapter 22, The Crocodile and the Scorpion. No shots were fired. Perhaps the rebels had received orders to leave the area. Perhaps Oteka was right, and they thought government soldiers might be too close. Perhaps Coney was holding up to the agreement not to attack on park land and frighten the wealthy tourists. Whatever the reason, when next Jacob peeked over the side of the boat, the rebels were gone. The crocodiles and hippopotami were still there, though. The crocodiles on the shore basked in the early morning sun with their mouths wide open, and the hippos wallowed in the mud. Above, tucked into the soaring cliffs rising from the river, birds swooped and nested, calling out to the day and each other. Jacob slumped back down. The rebels would be on the march, and with them went the rest of the boys from the George Jones Seminary for Boys, likely lost forever. Hours passed as the boat drifted along with the current. They tried to paddle, but the effort was beyond them. The last food they had eaten was the small mangoes many hours ago. The gentle rocking of the boat lulled them into a sleep of sorts, and then came a loud thud. Instantly they were awake and terrified. The boat had stopped moving. Again, Jacob was the first to look over the side of the boat. He expected a platoon of government soldiers, guns cocked, ready to kill. He expected to have his head shot off. At the very least, he expected to see 100 crocodiles and hippopotami licking their lips, ready to eat them. He expected just about anything except for what was in front of him. Look! Norman peeped over the gunwale of the boat. Oteka's, Paul's, Tony's, and finally Hannah's heads popped up one after another. The boat was wedged between rocks along the shore. Another boat was anchored nearby. Only Oteka took in their surroundings. The rest gaped, open-mouthed, at the scene before them. Was it possible? Could they believe their eyes? They were at a dock of some kind. Beyond the riverbank, in the middle of a grassy patch, sat a big, ancient gorilla chewing on leaves. He gazed back at them with a perplexed stare. "Is he harmless?" asked Hannah. "He is very big and very old," whispered Paul. "The lion was very big and very old too," hissed Norman. "Apes don't eat people, they eat leaves." Oteka was relying on what he could remember of his grandfather's stories, told many, many years ago. In truth, he wasn't at all sure what apes meant. "I did not think such beasts lived here," said Norman. "You tell him to leave," suggested Paul. Norman shook his head. "One of us should get out and see if he attacks," whispered Jacob. Images of the lion tearing people apart crossed all their minds. None of the boys volunteered for the job. "You can fight off rebels and lions, crocodiles and hippos, but you're all afraid of a big fat monkey?" Disgusted, Hannah ignored her aching ribs and crawled out of the boat and over the rocks. "Hannah, come back!" cried Jacob. He should go after her. He should do something. But Hannah just scrambled down off the rocks and stood on the sandy shore. Head back, body erect, hands on her hips, she looked dead-eyed at the ape. For all the attention the ape gave her, she might as well have been a stone. An interesting stone, a colorful stone, but a stone. "Iku Maber?" Hannah spoke politely. She even bowed her head a little. "Kopango?" Who was she talking to? Paul sat back down in the boat. He couldn't look. "The ape," replied Jacob. "What is she saying?" Oteka put his head down too. "I think she just said, 'Good morning, and how are you feeling?'" Jacob's voice rose in wonder. "What's the ape saying?" asked Paul. "Nothing so far," replied Jacob. Step by step, Hannah tiptoed around the ape. Mildly perplexed, the ape watched her, but only because there was nothing else to watch. Finally, she stood on the other side of the beast. With hands again anchored on her hips, she hollered, "Are you comin'?" Tentatively, cautiously, sheepishly, all 5 boys scrambled over the side of the boat. "Good morning!" Clutching their weapons, and each spoke with great reverence, hoping it might quell the animal's instinct to rip them apart limb by limb. Jacob looked the ape in the eye and felt the strangest sensation. It seemed human, more human than Coney and his band of soldiers could ever be. "This is the road to the lodge," said Paul. "Are you sure?" Jacob peered around. There were several sandy, rutted roads going in all directions. They could not afford to get lost. Government soldiers would mistake them for rebels. Which road? Which way? Paul pointed to a signpost overhead. Sambia Lodge, 2 kilometers. "Oh," said Jacob. Oteka threw his gun down. "We must go unarmed." Tony dropped his gun too. Paul and Norman tossed aside their pangas. That was it. They no longer had any means of protecting themselves. "I am the smallest," said Norman. "They might not kill me. I will go first." Jacob looked at Norman and thought the boy looked old, almost wizened. A shrunken head on a shrunken body, not a 10-year-old boy any longer. But then they all had knobby knees and elbows, protruding bones, and gaunt faces. They were not themselves, not any of them. Jacob looked from Tony to Oteka to Hannah. If they survived the next hour, how would they go back to being the people they once were? Shoulders back, head high, Norman the Brave walked down the middle of the rutted trail. One by one they followed, Jacob after Norman, Oteka last. "Stop!" yelled a disembodied voice. Guns nosed out of the tall elephant grass that grew along the trail. They stopped, hands in the air. They waited. Please, God. Please, God. Jacob could almost feel the bullets rip through his skin, almost see them dead and bleeding, sprawled out on the path like birds out of the sky. "We are students of the George Jones Seminary for Boys. We have escaped the rebels." Norman spoke bravely and loudly, although his voice broke a little in the middle. "We want to come home." And we will stop there for today. Looks like we should finish in the next section.